supporters of Always Take Notes. We are overhauling our offering on the crowdfunding site Patreon.
We've had a presence on Patreon, that's Patreon, for some time, but we've recently improved our rewards. Our central offer for those who support the show is a, now greatly expanded, sheaf of successful journalistic pitches, which we've solicited from friends who always take notes.
For those who may not know, a pitch is the document, generally sent by email, that lays out the idea for an article. And we've assembled a huge collection of battle-tested examples that all worked in the real world. Every one of them led to an article getting commissioned.
In the package, we now have successful pitches to, among others, The New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Financial Times, The Economist, The London Review of Books, Vanity Fair, Outside Magazine, The Spectator, The Sunday Times, Esquire, Granta, The Literary Review, Bloomberg Businessweek, and GQ.
Anyone who supports the show with $5 a month or more will receive the full compendium.
For those who contribute $10 per month, we'll also add a signed copy of our new podcast book, which is filled with more real-world advice from past guests on Always Take Notes.
Those who pay $15 a month can join a monthly call with Simon and myself to discuss any aspect of their writing lives.
We're keen for the pitch compendium to be a living and constantly growing document, so if any listeners have successful pitches of their own they'd like to include, do get in touch with us through the podcast website. In every case, we redact the editor's name and email address, so no one is breaking confidences by contributing. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we spoke with the journalist and author, Reni Eddo-Lodge.
We spoke to Reni about blogging as a student and making her way in journalism, about the post that led to her hit book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, published in 2017, and about reaching the top of the bestseller charts in Britain in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter protests.
It's a great episode, and we hope you enjoy it. Hello, Reni. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you with us. We wanted to start off by rolling back to 2014 and to the blog post that in time began the project that became your book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Could you take us back to where you were professionally, personally in your life at that stage, and what precipitated the blog post, and then how the sort of sequence of events that led towards the book began?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first off, thanks for having me. I am a listener and have been for some time, so it's exciting to be here.
So you know what to expect.
I have an idea. Okay, so where was I professionally and personally? Very much at the beginning of my writing career. I was a graduate. So I wrote that in 2014. So I was 24 at the time. And I had graduated kind of like into a recession. Jobs were not forthcoming. So I didn't really have a ton to lose, you know. I wasn't in a social position where like writing that piece would have like given me a bunch of like really harsh social consequences. I mention that because it's something that people always ask about now, you know. I was somebody who had been like heavily involved in activism during my time at university. And some of that, well, a lot of that activism was feminist activism. And I was involved in feminist activism because we're really going back here. But when I was a teenager, I was like really deeply affected and like negatively affected by street harassment, just like sexual harassment and things like that. So went to university, studied English literature, came across feminist theory, and I was like, wow, this is really speaking my language. This is explaining, you know, some of that like horrible discomfort and anger that I feel on the streets. And so I threw myself into feminist activism. So by 2014, I was a graduate who'd been involved in various sort of different strains of feminist activism for a few years. And around that time, we were having some really like heated discussions in like the British feminist discourse around race, basically, and whether or not it was worth having a perspective on race in feminist discussion. And, you know, now I'm older, I recognize that, you know, the parameters of who leads feminist discussion and whatnot, like, it's all really scarce. But at the time, you know, I think that there was this sense that, you know, people organizing conferences and things like that weren't doing a good enough job to understand that, like, women who were affected by discrimination in this country were not just affected by, like, gender discrimination, right? So that was all of the context that led me to writing that piece. I can't actually remember if there was a particular situation that led to me writing it. I just remember feeling so disappointed and frustrated at something that happened. It was a while ago now, that I kind of came to a bit of a conclusion myself that I can't really participate in these conversations anymore. And that's when I sat down and wrote it. I feel like maybe in the book I talk about watching something, but I can't remember exactly what it is, that said that suggested to me that if I keep engaging in these conversations, I'm just going to emotionally exhaust myself. And so one day I was really taken. I wasn't feeling very good. I was frustrated. I was upset. And I was feeling resigned. I think resigned is the right word. And I sat down and I wrote it. And I had a blog at the time. So it was posted on my blog. And I'd had that blog where I'd been publishing my writing since I was at university, because I was a student journalist. And that's where I published it. And I was on Twitter at the time too. So it pushed out to Twitter and it took on a life of its own, essentially. Even though I couldn't remember the situation that I wrote about now. And I didn't mention names or anything. And I think that was a strength of it, because, part of the reason it took on a life of its own is that lots of people came across it and, resonated with it deeply. And it felt like it applied to lots of people's lives in particular ways. Some of the barriers I describe in the piece about, denial and defensiveness when talking about racism, or at least trying to prove that racism even exists, or speaking about your own personal experiences, subtle or overt. I think a lot of people who came across that post on Twitter, who shared it, could relate.
So at what point did Bloomsbury come along in the aftermath of it, taking off?
Well, there's understandably a narrative that went viral, and then editors and agents were getting directly in contact with me and be like, oh, we want to publish you. And I can understand why that narrative exists, because there was a blog post and then there was a book, but it wasn't as simple as that. Because when it was published, I was trying to make my way as a freelance journalist. I wasn't really earning any money. I mean, I didn't earn any money writing professionally until the book was published. I wasn't even earning enough to pay my student loan for those years. I was self-employed, but, my family are from London, so I had somewhere to live at least while I was trying to make it happen. So I published that blog post, and at the same time, I'd done little bits of journalism here and there. I did an internship at The Guardian while I was at university. I was doing little pieces of freelance journalism here and there, doing my pitches, but not having much success, not being really perceived as a priority. But that piece took off. As a result of that piece taking off, I guess some editors sat up and took notice. I was put on some 30 under 30 lists. I think The Guardian had a 30 young people in digital media list, so they put me on that. And the African-American website, The Root, that covers Black news, essentially, they sat up, took notice, put me on a 30 under 30 list as well. So I gained a little bit of a following off the back of that. And then also, I think maybe I don't know, because a lot of how it was received and how it was picked up and how people paid attention to my writing after that post going viral, I wasn't party to their decision making. But I do know that after being put on some 30 under 30 lists, an editor at the New York Times, who was British, I'm so sorry, but I can't remember his name. This is all ages ago. I remember him following me on Twitter. This is when Twitter was good. And he reached out after I was aimlessly tweeting about how frustrating and difficult London living was. And he reached out directly and was like, do you want to write a piece for the New York Times? And this was huge to me, because I had at the time been struggling to be really taken seriously by the British press at all. I did have some really good editors. I worked with some great people, but, we were hobbling together what we could with very little, So this was like my first really exciting big commission. I remember being on the bus, saw this email come through, and I was like, yeah, of course I'd love to. And then we sort of like got into a bit of a dialogue about the piece that I would write about just like living in London and how it was really difficult and how I couldn't really see a future for myself in the city, despite being a kind of like a Londoner born and bred. And off the back of that piece being published, because I remember him saying like, this is off on spec. So, do everything that you can, but it may not get published. But it did. I worked with the fact checkers. And then not only was it published, they also put it in print in the international edition. And off the back of it going in print in the New York Times International edition, this was all in the space of like a year, by the way, all of this stuff. And literary agent based in London reached out to me and they were like, his name's Rupert Heath. He's since passed away, R.I.P. He reached out to me and he was like, I've read your piece in the New York Times. Like, have you ever thought about writing a book? So that was the kind of like windy trajectory of like my writing, and then going in from the blog post to then, working with Bloomsbury. My agent, Rupert, at the time was the person who knew the editors to put my proposal in front of, and one of those editors was Alexa von Hirschberg, who I know you've spoken to on the podcast before. So it was a pretty non-traditional way to being published. I didn't study journalism. I studied English literature. I've always been interested in writing. But outside of like 2 or 3 weeks as an intern at The Guardian when I was an undergraduate, like I really did not have an in. And I also didn't study journalism. So I didn't feel like I had the credentials to be like applying for a reporter position or anything like that. I was doing a lot of learning on the job, working for smaller magazines and like little underfunded sections of newspapers and stuff until all of that happened.
So as you know, we really love to talk about the kind of mechanics of how people get, their first book publication. And so with that process, once you've got an agent, how did the kind of book at proposal stage compare to how it was when it was published? And when it was being shopped, what was the kind of reaction and the level of interest from British publishers? Were there multiple houses who were interested, or was it just Bloomsbury? Take us, as you know, we love to kind of get into the weeds of like how all that bit worked.
Okay, so you want to know what the proposal was like. I haven't looked at it for a while, but recently for another project, I've been looking at proposals. And so I went back and looked at my own, and because I hadn't written super long form before, and it wasn't for want of trying, it was literally just that like I wasn't getting the commissions that would allow me to write proper long form stuff. So I feel like it was a proposal that was like short, lots of ideas, but I wasn't not necessarily comfortable, but I just hadn't been in the world of like long form before. And I actually remember that when I went to go and meet the staff at Bloomsbury, they did ask me about that. And I was like, if I have the opportunity and the funding to, then I'd love to do it, because so much of my work requires not just making political arguments, but like stuffing those political arguments with context. And I don't always have that opportunity. So I remember the proposal being short, let's say it was punchy, ambitious, full of the hubris of youth, all of that stuff. And I guess we could say it was confident. I mean, I was like 25 at the time. So, even though I'd got a lot of shit for, doing this kind of writing in the past, like none of that had really none of that was discouraging in a way where it was like, oh, I shouldn't be advancing this. And I did have like a real hunger at the time. Like I felt that, and this was infused in the reporting that I was able to do at the time. I used to report for this social housing magazine called Inside Housing. And I also had like a little part-time gig at the Telegraph. Well, I was not part-time, I was a freelancer, but Emma Barnett, who's now one of the presenters of the Today programme, I remember she was heading up the women's section of the Telegraph. And like, so in opposition with the newspapers like broader editorial line, she was commissioning me and a bunch of other people. And like, it was no money, but I could kind of just like go into any subject that I wanted to, like in discussion with her. She was an early supporter of my writing. So I always wanted to report around like race and inequality and gender, and I had like my little spaces to do it. And I remember in the proposal, like just promising that I wanted to do that more, in an ambitious way, long form. Inside Housing was also great as well for helping me take theory and really apply it to practice and ask them like questions about inequality to people who actually had a role in shaping it, which, you know, social housing institutions do, you know. I'm forgetting the rest of your question now. So you said, what was the proposal like?
And yeah, was there interest from multiple houses at that point?
Not really. Like we had two. We had interest from two houses. You know, there were houses that you thought would snap it up who weren't interested, said it was too ambitious. I'm not going to name names. You know, at the time, like there were quite like popular feminist books. Everyday Sexism was one of them. And, you know, I kind of knew Laura Bates through activism at the time. And her editor was interested in publishing it, and Bloomsbury were interested in publishing it. And I went with Bloomsbury because they're independent, but I really liked what Laura Bates' editor at the time had to say as well. So there wasn't tons of interest. It just wasn't really a subject that was perceived as having any like commercial interest, really. I think people perceived the subject to be really dry. It didn't really matter how much I tried to make my writing feel urgent and arresting to people. Like it was just not on the agenda.
You say in the book that you hope readers can use it as a tool. When you set out to write it, what did you want readers to kind of get from it? What was your ambition for the book?
I think I was so tired after all of those years in activism, like ostensibly surrounded by people who care about inequality and like wanted to make society a better place. Like I was like, why are they so resistant to an argument, or at least the evidence? You know, there's lots of different ways to interpret the evidence, but I found that there was an awful lot of resistance to like the basic argument that like Britain still has a long way to go in terms of understanding that racism exists, or that perhaps it's shaped our understanding of this country, or that like race has any factor in inequality at all. At the time, even though there was this conversation about feminism, the wider conversation was about class, and even then people being pretty dense about it.
The book was published in 2017, but then had this kind of huge moment in 2020. Could you tell us about those two different moments? Like, what was the reaction and the experience like on initial publication, and then 3 years later during the George Floyd protest period, how that kind of second wave happened?
I tell you what, I think they're the same people behind both waves, honestly. So I always had my readers, even when I was like a jobbing journalist not making any money, like I had my readers. And those people were excited when they heard about the book. And I remember, I still remember the number of pre-orders on publication week. It was like 700. And I was like, those are my ride or dies. Those people are my ride or dies. And I did a ton of publicity in 2017, which I feel like I did too much publicity, to be honest. But that undoubtedly, like, you know, put the book in some people's hands. But I think that my passion that I had back then, like, it translated into those early readers, and those early readers were real advocates for it. All the way through 2017, 2018, 2019, those people were early advocates, and I do believe that they're the people who literally like lent it to people, recommended it to people. I've heard about people buying a few stacks of the book and taking it into their workplaces. And it was really very much outside of the publicity that I did, because we all know that somebody could do tons of publicity, but if the word doesn't resonate with people, it doesn't resonate with people, right? Like publicity spend doesn't necessarily mean a hit. And it was really people doing a lot of word of mouth recommendations. And I believe it was those word of mouth recommendations that meant that in 2020, when people were searching for information, searching for an understanding of the world that could like go some way to explaining such a senseless murder, like it was those people who were early advocates that were like, you should read this. Well, I didn't do any publicity in 2020. Bloomsbury didn't do any marketing spend, to my knowledge. I feel like the final marketing push in the English language was like 2018, where the paperback came out. But in the space between like 2017 and 2020, it was a lot of word of mouth. And that word of mouth got to people who had like huge followings and were like super influential. And ultimately, it wasn't about whether or not I was doing publicity or like Bloomsbury was spending marketing. It was like people were recommending the book to one another. You know, I ended up doing Emma Watson's book club, and that was simply because, you know, she's somebody who's always kind of been interested in these broader ideas about feminism and inequality. And I think somebody in her circles recommended the book to her. And she was stirred by it and reached out, you know. And that was like early 2018. In fact, not just her, but lots of people in the creative industries were early advocates of the book. In the music industry, in the arts, tons of actors. So, yeah, it definitely helped. If I'd written this book and published it with like a small independent press, it probably wouldn't have had the reach it did. I'm not like discounting Bloomsbury's work, but it was very much, to my understanding, something that people were putting into one another's hands. And I used to hear about booksellers putting it into customers' hands as well.
The events of 2020 obviously sent it shooting up the bestseller charts, and I think to date now it's sold more than 1 million copies. You've said that you couldn't really allow yourself to be happy about that, given that the conditions that created that were so dire. Can you tell us a little bit about how you felt personally while these events were going on, and what it meant for your book?
Well, I mean, the pandemic was a scary time for all sorts of people. I was very anxious about the world. I think we all were. And I think in an ideal world, those wouldn't be the conditions that a Black author, you know, hits the top of the book charts for the first ever time, you know. But that would require a publishing industry that publishes differently. And we don't have that. So I felt pretty bad about it. But there was a wider context where like I was feeling pretty bad anyway, because the pandemic was a horrible time. And now, as time has passed, you know, I can own it as like a huge success, that I'm proud to have been the person who has written a book that opened a lot of minds, essentially, and definitely moved the needle on what we understand racism to be in this country, and probably across Western Europe, I would say, into some part like Australia and like other areas that I take in the book, like other areas of the world where I've taken the book. Like, I own being a person who moved the needle on understanding, and I'm proud to have been a person who put my neck on the line for that. Because, you know, when I speak about those early readers, they weren't necessarily people like having their minds blown. For many, it was also like, great, this is somebody who is actually like saying something that we've been saying behind closed doors for many years. And like, something that I mentioned at the top of our conversation is that I was able to sort of say the things I said, but also like do the reporting and doing like the pulling from the historical archives, because I didn't have anything to lose, you know?
Who do you think your early readers were? Were they white people, or were they in the Black community, or was it spread? And, you know, you said working in the creative industries. Do you have a sense of who that kind of initial demographic that then began this much bigger process were?
Yeah, I mean, I'm somebody who has had a kind of like foot in activism since I was a teenager. So initially those people were by existing networks. And then I think, you know, I was saying to somebody the other day, like, I know it was my existing networks, people who were also like very interested in like feminism and, you know, felt a keen sense of injustice around issues to do with race. And then I think people who were also interested in feminism. So some of those like audiences who were reading things like Everyday Sexism, because I was such a feminist voice. And even the first chapter that I wrote for the book, it's not the first chapter in the book, but the first chapter that I wrote specifically deals with my experiences involved in the feminist community, like it was definitely those people as well. And 7 years later, I can say confidently that I believe that the vast majority of my readers are women. I think they're under 40 largely. They live in cities, not just across the UK, across Western Europe and Australia and New Zealand. That's what I can say for absolute sure. And in terms of like that,
not in the US.
I think, I mean, the book was a New York Times bestseller, but that was in 2020, you know. And I think that the US is like very oversaturated. I mean, first off, it's a massive book market. Like, have you ever been to one of those huge Barnes and Nobles? It's overwhelming, much bigger than Forest Charing Cross. And if you go to the race section of one of those bookshops, because whenever I'm in the States, I'm always having a look. They're publishing on issues to do with like race and discrimination is like understandably a lot more developed. And so it was, I think, harder for me to cut through there initially, you know. Actually, when I did it, well, I remember when Emma put the book on her Instagram, the book like sold out across North America. And that was, even though we knew that it was coming, I think that like my US publisher were not prepared for the fact that obviously the influence that she had, but it also like speaks to how far the market over there, would people want to hear from a Black British person on these issues, you know? Whereas like across Europe or like Australia and New Zealand, I think that the perception was that British culture is much closer to their cultures. So not so much in the States. Like I've never toured the book in the States. So it was a New York Times bestseller and people do know me over there. But it did really well in independent bookshops over there. Also South Africa as well, for obvious reasons. It was another place where like it sold well.
You listen to the show, so you'll know to expect this question. But how did that book and its success change things for you financially?
Well, I didn't have any money, and now I do. Now I'm solidly middle class, financially, in a way that I'm not sure I would have ever have become without the success of that book. So like I said earlier, I'd kind of resigned myself to feeling committed to writing around racism and race inequality and writing and reporting on it, and also like looking at the evidence around me, looking at the people who I knew were doing it and saying, okay, well, you're never going to make any money from this, but it's something that you want to do and it's something you feel called to do, so this is what you're going to do. And, you know, to some extent, like I was young, I didn't have responsibilities or anything like that. So I could do that. And I think maybe if things hadn't changed for me, I would have had to change course eventually. But yeah, so I'd resigned myself to not making any money. And when the book came along, like the opportunity to write a book came along, like I didn't think that it was going to change my life financially. Like I got my advance, which was for 2 years of writing, definitely below minimum wage. But when it came to publication, I thought, well, that's the end of this journey. And I think if it hadn't taken off in the way it had, I would have just carried on like writing books. Because let's be honest, when it comes to books that are perceived as like dry, broccoli, nobody wants to read, which I think is what publishing kind of thought about the subject matter, even though I think I did a pretty good job at trying to make it interesting and engaging for people. There's lots of people who write books like that and they just put out a book every 2 to 5 years. And I thought that was going to be my trajectory, but it wasn't. And I still remember when I got those first royalty checks, like it earned out as advance immediately. And it basically allowed me to put money aside, allowed me to set up a private pension, buy property, all of these things that financial advisors say that we should spend our working lives trying to achieve. So it's allowed me to be comfortable, choose the writing projects that I want to do rather than having to work from a place of from a lack of choice, essentially, you know. I think with me and my approach to my writing, I've always been like a purist to my own detriment, especially in those early years. Like, I was like super principled, even if it meant that I didn't have any money. And that if I had a child who's pursuing this job, I just want them to feel safe and sheltered and fed, and so I would not advise them doing that. Transformed my financial life for the foreseeable future, and I'm not under any illusions that exact same thing is going to happen to me again. But I have a financial safety net now, which, you know, I described this to somebody the other day. Like, I dragged myself up to the top like Logan Roy. Do you know what I mean? Like, I really didn't have anything at the beginning of this. And it's an interesting position to be in as somebody who started not being particularly money motivated at all.
As long-time listeners of the show will know, we published Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, in 2023. We're pleased to say that we have now put together a new and updated edition of the book, which now features contributions from more than 100 past guests on the podcast.
The book, which is available now, is the distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 7 years. It offers frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing? Alongside all the great guests we quoted in the first edition, the update includes new material from Harlan Coben, Victoria Hislop, Lee Child, Megan Nolan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Philippa Gregory, Joe Nesbo, Paul Theroux, Hisham Matar, and Bethany Hughes. Published by Ithaca Press, the latest edition of Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, is available from all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
We wanted actually to roll back now to before the book and the blog post to your early life, your childhood. We saw you were born and brought up in London, and you loved reading children's classics as a child, so Roald Dahl, Harry Potter, that kind of thing. Take us back to your early life and then your kind of interest in writing and reading, and then also, you've alluded to this already, but getting drawn towards kind of activism and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I was an early reader. I was reading at like age 4. I was always an early reader, and I was always really affected by reading as well. I'm not quite sure why I was interested in books particularly. I'm not quite sure, but I remember being given a book of like Bible stories for children when I was really young with like illustrations. That really affected and distressed me. They should not be giving those books to kids because, you know, those Bible stories, they're quite traumatic. Terrible things happen. People are turning into pillars of salt. People are drowning. Shouldn't be given to the under 5s. So I remember reading that. We were in the library a lot, me and my mum, because we didn't have tons of money. So we weren't in a situation where it's like we could keep buying books. So we'd be in the library a lot. And I'd just be hanging out there reading, maybe like birthdays and stuff. We'd go to a big bookshop. It no longer exists, but it was called Dillon's. I think it's a Waterstones now in central London, but we'd like to get the bus. And that was like a treat. I always enjoyed being in the library and reading. And yeah, I did read a lot of Roald Dahl. But I just hoovered up everything. And I remember actually that we moved from South London, where I was an early reader, to North London when I was like 7. And I was shocked. I had this like superiority about me because I was like, I joined whatever class it was when you were in 7. I was like, some of these kids aren't reading yet. Like, what's going on? What are they teaching them in here? I was shocked that they weren't reading yet. And then I realized that, like, okay, I'm at an advanced level for reading in comparison in this school. Yeah, I remember like queuing up for the Harry Potter books because it was a competition. If you were a reader when you were a child, you had to read them first, because if you didn't, somebody would give you a spoiler over lunch or something like that. Yeah, and I'm not quite sure what it was that took me to reading, but I was always a very like still child, liked just sitting around and being with my imagination. And to some extent, I still do. I have to force myself to get up and move.
Me too. And where did the interest in feminism come from? I was interested to see that Simone de Beauvoir played a bit of a role in your kind of feminist awakening, if you can tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So the interest in feminism did come from like direct personal experience, you know. I don't ever remember finding myself being told things about what I can or can't do as a girl when I was growing up. But, you know, I grew up in Tottenham in North London, and like when I hit puberty, like the street harassment, I found it unbearable. I think that as I get older, I think some people understand it to be just a unpleasant part of growing up as a girl, but I hated it. I truly hated it. Like that shit radicalized me. And it just completely radicalized me. I can't even describe how much I hated it. And the rage still really stays with me. And I remember talking to friends about it at the time. And some people were like, oh, you should take it as a compliment, this, that, and the other. But by the time I got to university a few years later and I read something like The Second Sex, and I was like, okay, this is what she's describing. Like she's describing a society in which, because I'm a woman or basically a girl at that time, I'm literally seen as an ornament in these people's lives. I'm literally perceived as decoration. I don't get to have my own subjectivity when I'm walking down the street, you know? So yeah, it deeply resonated with me to read some theory that like contextualized what I was experiencing. But like my interest in feminism was drawn directly from a sense of deep indignation and anger about what was happening to me personally, and experiencing like these broader cultural conversations that was like, this is just what it's like welcome to womanhood. I absolutely hated it. And as soon as I realized that there was like some kind of like wider movement that I could be involved in that challenged it, I was like, that's what I'll be doing with my free time.
We saw this other quote from you about getting anemia when you were freelancing and the kind of subject of exhaustion, which is something that's come up with other writers who are working for themselves and feel this tremendous pressure to do anything that comes their way, and you know how difficult it is to turn stuff down. Can you tell us about that experience at that time, but then maybe, you know, later on after the success of your book and so forth, how you've dealt with, you know, having a lot of demands on your time and being dragged in various different directions at once?
Yeah, I mean, I've not always dealt with it well, especially as, you know, to be a successful freelance writer is basically like running a small business. And at the beginning, I tried to do everything myself, which I can't do. I'm not good at accounts, you know. So I really struggled, and it affected my mental health quite significantly. But then obviously like becoming really anemic, and like I was admitted to hospital and things like that. That all happened while I was writing the book, actually. Like a couple of mad things happened while I was writing the book. I was admitted to hospital, and I used to cycle across London, and somebody like literally was hit by a car and got concussion. Like it's like the world was trying to take me out before that book was published. It was crazy. But, so before the book and before like financial security, well, I was basically sometimes put in positions where it's like you have to rest and you can't continue to work because it's not safe, especially when I was like knocked off my bike, because concussion affects the brain. And I was like, I'm literally not thinking correct. I'm not thinking straight. And like, I have to use my brain for work. This is really scary. But now I'm able to take time off. And, you know, something that always appealed to me about being self-employed, even when I didn't really have any money, was I could work when I wanted to. So even if I was like on deadline for something, if I needed to rest during the day and work in the evening, I was able to do that, even when I wasn't earning much. And that continues to be the case now, but I keep to more regular working hours now. But, you know, particularly when it comes to my own writing, I'll often do it in the weekends.
You mentioned earlier the kind of connection you made with an editor at the New York Times, but, you know, in those early days of freelancing, how did you get commissions? How did you reach out to new outlets and find places that would accept your work?
I was just pitching. I was like paying close attention to the news agenda, thinking about my own angles on them, paying attention to the discourse, you know. what journalists do, basically. I was just pitching, and sometimes I get responses, oh, we've already got so-and-so writing about that, or oh, it's not going to be that interesting to readers, or this, that, the other. And Twitter was a big thing back then. So, I'd be paying close attention to what people were talking about. And sometimes, well, actually, I feel like I used to tweet a lot. Like, I'd be paying attention to the conversation and participating in it as well. But yeah, just pitching, sometimes cold pitching, sometimes trying to build relationships with editors who I'd met at events, or, had connected with online, things like that. Just, yeah.
As you know, on the show, we often find with writers who've had a big hit that, although it's something they've dreamed about, it can also be quite a kind of discombobulating experience. And then you had I suppose, the additional complexity that this is at the head of a hugely kind of important and significant cultural moment. I mean, how did you find the decision of what to do next and stuff like that? What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I kind of always knew that whatever I wanted to do next, I didn't necessarily want my face to always be out there. So during the time of the books like peak success, which probably existed, that was probably a good, I describe it to people as 3 years of maybe I had 3 years of almost every time I left the house, somebody would recognize me, especially as I live where my readers live. It's not easy, I think, to do work that is ultimately observational when everybody knows who you are. And if I was sent to do a story, which sometimes I would, sometimes it would help and open doors and sometimes it would hinder. Because of all of that, I kind of knew that, okay, this work is kind of a phenomenon. And just because of all of the publicity I'd done, and also I was really young, I was 27 when it was published. So it was basically turning me into a bit of a celebrity. I was like, well, I kind of have to let this die down. There was either two options. One, which was seize on the burgeoning celebrity and do celebrity influencer activities, of which I had offers to do. But I didn't really want to. I figured that's not really why people are interested in me. I'm not a model or an actress or a musician or anything like that. So I didn't go that route. And there was some people pushing me to do that because, a lot of my readers are young. So my social media followers really swelled. But instead I decided that I would take time out. I had to take time out post 2020. I started to feel a bit personally targeted. And then I decided that I wanted to do some work that felt a little bit more behind the scenes, supporting other writers and things like that.
What kind of things are you doing behind, if you're able to talk about them, to support other writers?
I can't say because it's not announced yet. I'm so sorry. I'd hope
worth asking.
I hope that I would be able to tell you, but I can't say. But it's allowing me to work with exciting writing and ideas, and work on my own writing on the side and things like that, that I'm excited about. I wanted to always be involved in writing. I'm still doing freelance journalism, and I'm still working on my own writing as well. I always want to be involved in writing and ideas and things like that, but the idea of doing another big publicity run, it doesn't appeal to me.
Do you have a new book project?
Not under contract. That's what I'll say. Not under contract. But I'm writing for myself, and I always feel that especially the first, 10,000 words, it takes me ages. The first chapter that I wrote of Why that took me a year.
I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates in America, he took a very different direction. He went and wrote fiction. He did kind of comic books and stuff like that. Has that ever been something that's appealed to you?
Well, comic books, no, because I've never been interested in them. I've tried, but they never appealed to me. Fiction, I don't know. I mean, doesn't appeal to me in terms of it's not what I feel compelled to write. I feel whenever I feel compelled to write, it's always rooted in what's around me, reality. But what I'm writing now is, I don't know if it's going to be fiction or not. I've got no idea. I mean, I feel fiction requires some skill of plot and so far, like most of my writing, the storytelling has come from stuff that's actually happened. Because I often feel like stuff that's happening is crazy. Someone's got to write this down, you know?
You know, I still have the thing of reading novels and marveling at the fact that people have come up with this story. So I empathise with you on that. Could we talk now about the Vogue profile that you sent over of Saoirse Ronan? How did that kind of project come about?
Yeah, so I've been kind of like linked in with the editors of Vogue since the book was published. You know, I've written a few pieces for the magazine and also like I've appeared in a shoot that they did a few years back now where it was like, I don't know, next gen feminism or something like that. And yeah, they reached out. Actually, Giles, who I know that you've spoken to on the podcast, reached out. Said there's this new film out, Steve McQueen film. We think you'd be the right person to do the profile because we don't just want the profile to be about Saoirse, we also want it to be about the film. And I'd actually pitched to them earlier this year because I'd gone to go and see Slave Play on the press night. It occurred to me when I went to the press night Slave Play that like the audience, that's the Jeremy O. Harris play that's wildly controversial, but also very entertaining. It occurred to me that like that audience, honestly, that audience was like, hey, this is your life of my career. Like everybody I looked around and I was like, I'm seeing old mentors, I'm seeing enemies, I'm seeing friends, like everybody's in this audience. And then I thought like, so many interesting people here, but like, where are the reviews going to go? You know? So I just went to Vogue and I was like, this play has really, it's just got my mind turning. I'd love to write about it. And I don't know if this was directly connected, but a couple of months later, Giles was like, yeah, do you want to do this big profile? And I haven't done tons of magazine journalism. So I was a little bit intimidated by it, but I was like, fine, let me do it. So that's kind of how it came by. And also I knew it was going to be a Steve McQueen film. I knew that like the themes in his work and like the themes in my book, not dissimilar. So I felt like I'd be pretty decently equipped to do it.
Just for our listeners, in case anyone hadn't heard of that, that's Giles Hattersley, who, Reni, do correct us. I think when we interviewed him, he was features director, but he's now executive editor. Is that right?
Yes, he is.
Yeah. I remember when we talked to him, he said, like, you know, a Vogue piece is about celebration. I think that was the term that, you know, Toby used. I mean, how much of a, like, latitude do you feel that you have writing in that, you know, in the magazine? I thought it was interesting reading the piece that, you know, you've done the legwork, like you've gone to talk to the director, you've talked to people who worked with her and stuff like that. But like, how kind of a prescribed direction do you feel you have to move in writing for the magazine?
I was given complete license outside of like having some insider fashion knowledge, which obviously the editors of Vogue have and I don't because I'm not a fashion journalist. They really left me to my own devices. So I didn't do a bunch of like going off to read all of their like previous profiles of like famous actresses. I read a little bit. I think I read like a profile of Zendaya in maybe American Vogue. But ultimately I came to a bit of a decision that like they'd come to me because of my expertise on the subject matter that Steve McQueen does his work about, but also after having a look at like doing a deep dive on some of Saoirse Ronan's like back catalogue, I was really pleased actually, because I'm not like the biggest film buff. Like I read or listen to music, so I was approaching it as an outsider. I was really pleased to like to go into her back catalogue because I was like, okay, this person is a serious creative. She's not really there for the glitz. She's not really there for the glam. Like, there's a real reason why she's been Oscar nominated by like 4 times by the age of 30. Like, she is serious about her craft. That really excited me as a writer because I'm also serious about my craft, and something that really like makes me feel alive is being around like really talented, interesting creatives. And, you know, I said earlier in our interview that my book really took off across like the arts and the creative industries. I don't think that's a coincidence. Like, I come from this background of activism and journalism, but ultimately, like, I am a creative person. I love creativity. And I know in my heart that part of the reason that the book did well was not just the subject matter, it was also the writing skill. And actually, I think that, like, you know, writers, our job is to communicate emotion. And And when done well, it's not actually that different from acting. They also have to communicate emotion. So when I went into her back catalogue, I was like, this is somebody I'm really actually looking forward to talking to, because I kind of get what she's doing as a writer. And writers and actors have always had always had an interesting relationship. When done well, especially with fiction writers, like writers are writing the stories that actors perform, right? So that was, after I went into Saoirse's back catalogue, I was like, I'm actually very excited to meet her. And I wasn't disappointed. I think that like acting gets a bit of a bad rap as a profession, but she's really talented, and that definitely came through the conversation that I had with her. And I kind of approached that profile as I wanted to understand, how is somebody Oscar nominated at like 13? Like, what kind of person gets Oscar nominated at 13 and then repeatedly before the age of 30? Like, who is this person? That was my question I wanted to answer. And maybe, I don't know if you'd agree with me. I hope I tried to answer it in that piece.
I loved just the details of her gardening and cooking with the onions she grows and things like that. She came across as a very kind of ordinary person with phenomenal skill. In terms of the logistics of writing the profile, how did you wrangle access? Did Vogue do it for you? And then in terms of setting up those secondary interviews with like Paul Mescal and people, how did you get the time with them?
Yeah, so in terms of like the fashion creatives, obviously Vogue's all over that. They communicated with Saoirse's PR people in order to get that time with her. She was super generous with her time. We spent like 4 hours together. And, obviously, like, I was corresponding with Apple, who were distributing the film, to speak to Steve McQueen. But people like Greta Gerwig, that was a funny story, actually. That was my own network. And I think it was just like actually a bit of a logical conclusion of like having my toe in all of these different fields of like writing, activism, journalism, and like general creativity for the last decade. I managed to find Greta Gerwig's reps through somebody who I used to be in a activist network years ago, who's now a novelist, who's like best friends with somebody whose boyfriend was a producer on Barbie. Like, that's how I managed to get, because she's unfindable, And then with Paul, actually, it was one of the editors at Paul Mescal, one of the editors at Vogue, who spoke to him, because it got to the point where like I couldn't work on a piece anymore because I had a holiday booked. So they were like, we'll handle that. I'm trying to think, who else did I speak to for the piece? There was a lot of even just like where she wanted to go and eat and things like that, like trying to find, she wanted to eat at a restaurant that didn't take lunchtime bookings. So I had to find the owner. I had to like track down the guy who owns the restaurant and be like, we are coming at this time. And just stuff like that, really. And that was, again, through a friend who ran a business at Edinburgh, and like she was linked into some kind of like Edinburgh business owners network and managed to find him. So it was a lot of just like really like working on my own networks, basically.
We're coming up against our time limit now, but a final question from me, and actually coming back to the book. You talked about your readers in Britain and Europe and so forth. I was wondering, what has been the response to the book from African readers? You mentioned South Africa, but do you get a sense from more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So yeah, there was, and a lot of that data I was giving you is based on sales specifically. In terms of like, I remember there was like a lot of sales in South Africa, but outside, in terms of Africa, I did a literary festival in Lagos called the Ake Festival, maybe 2019. And that was a really interesting experience. I mean, I'm Nigerian. But outside of that, like, I haven't been summoned over to the continent very often. And I couldn't speak to anything particularly notable in terms of like the African response. But what I will say is that Nigeria specifically, like, I think that there's quite a few creatives speaking to the Black experience, the Black British experience, who are Nigerian. And many of us find ourselves at that festival, is what I've noticed. But yeah, I couldn't It's a really good question. Not one I feel particularly equipped to answer, actually.
And as a final question from me, is there anything that you're working on that you can tell us about?
Not really. I'm so sorry.
That's absolutely fine. Well, we can wrap up there. Thank you so much, Reni, for your time, and wishing you all the best with your mysterious work going forward.
Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Reni Eddo-Lodge. Her website is renieddolodge.co.uk. She's on Instagram at Reni Eddo-Lodge. She's on Twitter at Reni. And Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race is published by Bloomsbury. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Reni?
We had been trying to get her on the show for a long time, so it's excellent to have her. Also really good to hear that she is a listener to Always Take Notes. I thought that this is something we say all the time, but the experience of navigating a big hit, multiplied by the fact that when a big hit is your first book, and in her case when it's tied very clearly into a kind of political and social moment. I thought she was thoughtful on that. I was very interested, and I'm not sure we got to the bottom of this, of what she will do next, what her lineup and way to go is. And I suppose that we got, I suppose, to this kind of irony that she wrote a book about not talking to white people about race and then had to spend a lot of time talking to white people, including ourselves, about race. But yeah, I think it's, I think we are able on the show to have conversations not only about how kind of thrilling that can be for a writer, but how complex and, not always straightforward some of those moments can be. So I think something that is a good part of the interviews we do. What about you, Rachel?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with all of that. And it was interesting to hear about the roots of her interest in feminism and activism, her deep indignation and anger at harassment, street harassment, which is something I can empathise with. And on a lighter note, I enjoyed hearing about the amusing side of organising a celebrity profile with reference to her piece in Vogue. I remember her talking about finding a restaurant that they could have to themselves and the various logistics that are required to make something like that happen.
Absolutely. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to and what have you been consuming culturally?
I have been working on a story, I think I mentioned it last time, about the Netflix very lavish adaptation of 100 Years of Solitude. So that should be published by the time this gets out. And I've also been watching The Diplomat, the second season of that, which I think is better than the first season. So yeah, those are the two things I've been doing and consuming. How about you?
Well, I finished the, I would say, minus first draft of my book last week, and I'm now cutting it, which is a lot of cutting, but I think, again, it will be fine. And so I spent 3 days really just reading through it and marking what is to stay and what is to go. And now in pretentious metaphor land, it's as though it's like, I think today it's the unkempt bush about to be transformed into the immaculate topiary, I hope is the effort. Yeah, I find it quite stressful, to be honest. It's a fair amount of time pressure, and I very much want to be on time and on length, because I think these things are rare in the literary landscape and therefore are good things to aim for. In matters cultural, I read Andrew Hagen's his slightly less new novel, Mayflies, which I enjoyed because we're interviewing him. And that is largely it, really. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. We're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.